I'm going to talk about addiction and what that is. But actually, it is about well-being, and of course, most of it applies to all of us. It applies to human beings. I mean, addicts are human beings. Addicts, alcoholics, compulsive gamblers, codependents, people with eating disorders, workaholics. The idea really is, why don't they just stop? That's logical. You know, if it's not working, just stop. So often say at the rehab, you know, the group's either the most idiotic group of people in the world, or there's something else going on. I choose to believe they're not the most idiotic group of people in the world. There's something else going on. And in what the previous speakers were talking about, you know, somewhere in the mix there'd be some addicts and alcoholics, in the policymakers, in the employees, in all these different teams. Most of the people I work with are they're in employment. Some of them run their own businesses, some of them are millionaires. They work in every area of society, and they end up in a rehab, or they end up sitting opposite me for one-to-one psychotherapy. And somewhere there are groups of people who've employed them. So unless they staggered into the room and made it fairly obvious that they have a problem with drugs or alcohol, you didn't know. And this is the nature of the beast. This is the issue, really, is that the addict, the denial, is so powerful that not only does the addict themselves believe whatever they say and how it is, but they seem to be able to transmit this out. And it's very difficult to work out whether someone is or isn't. In fact, it's more of an art than a science. It throws out, there's a film, I choose to believe this is true, but someone might know. It was a film about the sound barrier, the first guys who broke the sound barrier in a plane. And they kept crashing the plane. They get to this point and everything started shaking apart, and they did what they intuitively knew to do, and the plane exploded. They just couldn't understand what they were doing. Until in the film, I don't know who it was, David Niven or something like that, they did completely the opposite. And that saved his life, and they broke the sound barrier. I've no idea if it's true. There's probably a lot of poetic license in that. But that paradox is really important when you're looking at addiction. Logic isn't going to get you anywhere. It's not a logical, it's not an intellectual illness. The way we operate, I've operated, and I myself being what you'd call an addict in recovery, it's an illness that we're born with. And that's pretty much it. It's fairly vague. And this is a concept, so I don't know if it's true, but it appears to fit what we observe. It appears to be incurable because people follow some kind of program for 20, 25 years and then they relapse, and it's not good. So the concept seems to fit very nicely, and I think most of the world is gradually coming around. WHO, UNODC, DSM-5, the sort of psychiatric Bible in America, now refers to these things as diseases. It's not, as before, it's just lack of willpower or something like that. And I suppose, you know, addiction, my experience of it is it's hell. You know, it's not a good thing. It's not like people do it continually until they die because somehow they're getting something out of it. It's hell. And on those the charts we had before, I'd certainly be dead by now, a long time ago, if I hadn't been helped. And there hadn't been policies in the workplace, which was that amazed me. So really, it's just to get across initially, addiction, it's not really about someone drinking too much. You know, some people drink too much, maybe some of you think you drink too much, and then you do something about it, you stop. And I think loads of people do that. this is when that can't happen. There is no point in saying to an employee who is suffering from this illness to stop. I mean, you can use as many carrots and sticks as you want. It's not going to work because you're asking them to control the weather. I think, I can't remember who it was, there was in the House of Lords a long time ago when I got into recovery, one of the members said something like, telling people to stop using drugs is like telling children not to catch a cold. And that really is it. When you're working with the people that we're working with, which, as I say, are you. If I was at the rehab now, any of you could be sitting there and you're in for drugs, alcohol. After a week or two, you'd all pretty much look the same. You know, it's not, I suppose still there's this idea, isn't it, that this is something that happens to people who end up on the park bench drinking perfume or something. I guess that's where we'll all end up if there isn't an intervention. There are other compulsive gambling. I mean, gambling is a big thing at the moment. Again, if you're a compulsive gambler, I suppose it's like having adverts for heroin on the television and kind of saying, you know, stop when the fun stops. If you're a compulsive gambler, that's not going to work. That's telling children not to catch colds again. Workaholism. I mean, some of you may think, I don't know, would people put their hands up if they think they might possibly work so much that it causes problems in their lives? That would be the you don't have to put your hands up. I think I am, actually. I think it's another brand of this addiction that's beginning to play out in my life. So really it's this idea, it's an illness, it's a disease, this is the concept. And actually your problem, having this illness isn't the problem. It's how you live with it. So I'm pretty sure I'll die with the illness of addiction. It's okay, all is well. Because there are things that can be done to live with this illness in a different way. It appears to be lifelong. As I say, people get an awful lot of clean time. Their lives change radically. I mean really radically. But it seems to be always in the background. So vigilance. And there are plenty of self-help 12-step groups out there which are free, which, you know, in this day and age is amazing. There are quite a few policies. I can make these available afterwards. You know, there's a lot of policies. There's the Health and Safety Commission. One of the key things, obviously, in an organisation is to have a meaningful policy. And what I'm suggesting is that, but that policy, you need to see that policy through the lens of it's an illness. Now, it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You know, just going sort of, I'm sorry, I've got this illness, so that money I nicked, or whatever, that drink driving. No, that one is responsible for everything we do. But it's understanding that the logic of saying to someone, well, you need to stop that or cut that down, that's not my experience over, I don't know, can't remember, 40 plus years, both sides of the fence, is that's just not going to work. It doesn't matter what works, really, as long as it works. If tomorrow they discover, I don't know, in America somewhere that skipping therapy works, well, then that's what we'll be doing, skipping therapy. But that doesn't appear to work. But we know what works. What seems to work is this understanding that, again, this paradox, as with the fighter pilots, is in a sense, we're not trying to help people to stop drinking. This is the kind of weird bit. What we're trying to do is help them into some kind of recovery. And if they get into recovery, they won't drink because it's no longer, the need is removed. They won't take heroin. They won't take cocaine. They won't need to buy everything in sight to make themselves feel better. So that's the the tricky bit. And you just, I suppose, with most of this stuff, when you're working with people, again, it's having this policy that allows these ideas to exist within them. So what are you going to do? And I thought what I'd briefly talk about is, because it's empirical evidence, I suppose, is my own experience working in a government department. I was employed as a full-blown heroin addict, alcoholic, compulsive gambler. I had a degree, miraculously. And I turned up, in my suit, and I did all the stuff. And of course, I was going there because I thought, well, if I get a proper job, then of course I'll stop drinking and using drugs, which we call a geographical. Change everything externally, and everything will change internally. Of course, within 2 days, I was at it in this government department, and my all the things that have been said, productivity, I did things my way, and if you didn't like that, I was kind of disturbed that I'm delivering all this stuff. The fact that I turn up at 6 in the morning when no one else is around, but I work hard. Lunchtimes were sort of movable feast. I know they're an hour for all of you, but for me, because I get in so early and leave so late, it was all the arrogance, the typical addict, really. That's how I see it. Was if I can make sense of what's happening, you should be all right about it. And that's. I don't think that's the preserve of alcoholics and addicts. It's my experience with people. A lot of people are like that. And I got away with it because I was bright and I could deliver things, but terribly erratically. And most people at work are, to flip the meaning that was used before, are what we call enablers. And enabling from a therapeutic perspective is allowing someone to stay in denial. So I was never confronted. People just went along with it, you see. And that's enabling. Hopefully that makes sense. I can remember a few meetings I was at, open plan office, and I would literally sort of gonk out and suddenly wake up with some noise, and I'd be, suddenly I'm back in the room. Was never confronted about this behaviour, because people generally don't like confrontation. They'll go into their own sort of cognitive dance about, oh yeah, he's probably tired, because he's working so hard. It would never occur to them. The good news with all of this is what you need is to be sort of healthy managers. You need a healthy manager around you who's got some boundaries. You don't need really to know about addiction. If I work with organisations around addiction, I'm not going in there to talk about addiction per se. I'm going in to say, no, what you need is healthy managers who, if someone's late 4 days in a row, something happens. You don't need to sort of know about addiction. It's just like their behaviour is unacceptable. Or they continually do things their way when you've asked them to do it. No, this is the way we do things. So again, most of this is common sense. To help each other be boundaried. And you will find, again, I was working for a big institution or academic institution in Glasgow, and what they'd done, they'd moved someone around who was clearly an alcoholic, but at a high level. And they've done everything but simply confront the blindingly obvious truth, that the emperor has no clothes. Yeah, and I remember that from the government department I was in. There were certain high, under-secretary level civil servants who you just couldn't get them in the afternoon. And that was code for God knows what that was. And they had really good PAs who would block any. So it was a sort of institutional enabling, an institutional denial of. But I'm saying all of this really just to convey is that to me it seems this is in all walks of life. I'd be surprised if all of you here don't know someone you may have a suspicion about. Maybe they have a problem. I think that's kind of normal. It's just, I suppose, what's it got to do with you? It's being clear on, well, so what are you going to do about it? Or is you doing something about it enabling? Because there are others who should be doing something about it. All of this really leads to the idea of, I think that the last speaker was talking about the sort of nature, this illness, or it's referred to as a sort of physical, mental, spiritual illness. And it's always the spiritual bit that sort of tends to turn people, they're like, oh, what's all this spiritual illness? What it means to me, and I come from a scientific background, so I wasn't overly impressed when I first heard all of this stuff. It's simply the idea that it's not you, that we need input from others, whether that's a superhuman being, nature, two mates, doesn't really matter, as long as it's not you. And ultimately, this illness of addiction, it is about kind of a self-centered, selfish center of the universe. Everything revolves around getting the drug of choice or the behavior of choice. So again, with workaholism, nothing else exists. It is just that absolute mission. So around you there'll be collateral damage, but we can't see that. We must simply plough that trough. Is that the right phrase? Yeah. You can hear it again. It's a mood-altering activity. And so, by supporting someone, really what it means is that you're bringing in other heads, if you like, to start helping that person to deal with what for them is impossible. And it's acknowledging that. It's not belligerence. I could not stop. Full stop. I still can't. And yet, I haven't used for 28 years. Now that's kind of weird. That's well, so how do you do that? Well, I do that by using other people like yourselves to support me to live on planet Earth in a different way, which seems to, my experience is I don't seem to have to use any mood-altering substances. I crashed at work in the sense of trying to juggle all these balls in the air, at the same time believing I should be promoted all the time. So, you know, I couldn't quite understand why that wasn't happening. I mean, and the people that worked were my managers. You know, some of them I did sort of apologise. You know, I went back and acknowledged what an absolute nightmare it must have been, trying to get me to do anything I didn't want to do. I remember, yeah, the bank manager, he went off ill, and I went back in recovery to sort of see him, and oh no, he's not here, he's gone off ill, and I had this terrible, that was me, you know, I was just endlessly doing things my way and not, you know, I think it's just that sense of all I cared about was the drink and the drugs. So the end came. I didn't realise actually at all, I didn't even know that there was a departmental policy. I got called into welfare, as it was called, welfare, and what you were saying, isn't it? There was one person in welfare, this is back in 1989, and she covered about 500 people all over the world. It was remarkable. Yeah, suddenly I just thought, well, they'll sack me, obviously that's the end of this, I'll just get it over with. But they were very helpful, they had a policy. I'm not sure they fully understood the policy, and I'm not sure they'd ever had, I felt like a sort of captive animal, a captive addict. I'm not sure they had one before. They'd had some alcoholics, but they kept sort of treating me like I was different, and I kind of understood I wasn't. No, this is all the same, but they were very, like an endangered species or something. So they were very, the truth is they they really tried their best. And they had this sort of guideline. They gave me so much time off work, so it cost money. They gave me 6 months off work. They paid full pay for the first 3, and they paid half for the next 3. And their view was sort of, right, off you go then. I just thought, well, this is good. I can be off work and carry on drinking. I mean, what's not to like? They're going to pay me. But enough was enough, even for me. And I got into recovery. I went to rehab, and it followed this model. So back in 1989, back since the 30s, there's been this model. And everything changed. I mean, everything changed in the sense that I was told it wasn't my fault, it was this illness. You're responsible, David, for everything you've done, so let's not get carried away here. It wasn't a get out of jail free card, but it made a profound difference. And what they got across to me is that I would never be able to sort this out on my own. And I guess I was so finished that I just went for it. I returned to work. I inadvertently got put with someone I believe was an active alcoholic. There's sort of some higher power sort of karma there, you know. So I'm back at work. I'm out of a rehab. I'm welcomed back. I was moved to a different department, and they put me with someone who would go to the bank every day. And I learnt this was another code. And back then, most of these buildings, you would have a bar in the building. Back in the 90s, I've no idea what it's like now, but back then. So really, to make a long story short, I worked for 20 years in that department, 18 years. Because of that policy, because of people acknowledging they didn't really understand what they were doing with it. You know, these policies tend to get written by someone sitting somewhere who's not entirely au fait with the real world, but they did the best they could. And what it did is it gave me the space to engage in a program of recovery. It meant that I could nip out to go to these meetings at lunchtime. Luckily I was in London. So there were lots of self-help groups, and they didn't stop me doing that. I remember I got posted out to the South Pacific, and it always gets me, isn't it, this sort of heroin addicts from King's Cross. I'm out in the South Pacific representing the British government as the aide attaché, shaking hands with the Minister of Finance, and it was like, how did I get here? What happened? What happened? Well, what happened was I was given a chance. I was given space to move into, so I could thrive. But what was written into my contract was one satellite call a week to one of my people who supported me in London, which back then would have cost a lot of money, but that had to be written into my contract. And it gave me that connection that I needed. I found people on that Pacific island who were like me. So it appears we're everywhere, even in this room. But you know, it was a real eye-opener that globally I wasn't alone, and it was okay. You know, this illness. I didn't wake up one day and think it would be a good career move to be a heroin addict. Stuff happened, and being told that this was this illness, it gave me. It allowed me to live with myself until I could forgive myself. So work, I think, got back a lot in return for those 3 or 4 months' pay. And for that I'm very grateful. In the end I left because I had the agency to do so, which they had given me. And they supported me to get my master's, which was fantastic. I touched on enabling. I think this is one of the keys, is really it's about within the organisations that you belong to, it's having clear boundaries around what is acceptable and what isn't at work, whatever that is, and that those are enforced. Because actually, to enable, we refer to it as banging nails in the coffin. People are literally enabled to death Because no one will confront the obvious, you know, that, no, actually, if you had a drink, normal people don't have a drink and you smell it on their breath at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday. This is not, or you find a drink hidden somewhere, or what, in their office. What is going on? But actually, it's the simpler stuff, you know, when people start to become unreliable, they start to arrive late, they start to do things, they dance to their own sort of music, not yours. They start to isolate. These are keys for any human being, aren't they, that you would want to at least check, as you said, wasn't it, that it's not always the obvious thing that's the problem. There are peripheral things that are going on. And again, back to good management, good managers who care, you'll pick this stuff up. You may not know what it is, but it'll help the individual forcibly have to confront reality. And that's the point at which change becomes possible. I had a little drawing that was going to put up. We're about there, aren't we? Yeah, you won't see it. It's this idea of we get bent out of shape. And this will happen at work with stress, with anxiety, with working too much, with too much pressure being put on people. And what happens is you get bent out of shape. You know, your head thinks one thing. Your emotions are in a different place, but you look like something else. So you become bent out of shape. And that's, to sustain that is painful. Or you take it home and the wrong people get attacked, the wrong people get the verbal noise. And I think with all of this, including with addiction, so if we get bent out of shape and one suffers from the illness of addiction, we know what you're likely to do. But this happens with all humans. This getting bent out of shape where you want to scream or say, no, I don't want to do that. But there's a part of you and you're feeling angry, but what do you do next? You go, yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll cover that. And this bent out of shape is miserable. And if you're an addict, it will lead to relapse. It will lead to further using. So it's this, how do we get from the bent out of shape into the congruent? So we breathe, we think what we think, it sits well with how we feel, and we look like it. And a lot of the work that we do dealing with addiction, but a lot of the work that I've done within the department I worked in, I became involved in staff development, HR, was getting people out of this bent out of shape state and just to be. And that's, to me, if that's not well-being, I don't know what is. So to finish, that was the final irony. When I was working in Bangladesh, when I was working in South Africa, when I worked in Afghanistan, I put my teams through the same process that I'd been put through as an addict and alcoholic. None of them were, but if the 12-step approach is anything, it's a behaviour change program. And it was amazing to see people express themselves and confront what was disturbing them. And I found no difference between women in Bangladesh to men in Afghanistan to different tribes in South Africa. Once you got down to an emotional level, it seemed to me that was the universal language. And before I left DFID, there was everyone was talking about emotional intelligence. But again, talking about it in an intellectual way. So it was always kind of doomed to go round and round in this circle. It was about emotional intelligence, emotions. And I still think that's probably a sort of coal face that we need to get to grips with. How to be emotional in the office. That's okay. I hope that touched on the question. We are here, the team's here. If you have any questions about addiction or the shift into the workplace of how to develop staff, then please ask me. You may well do in the questions afterwards. Thanks.